So we're so excited to have Rachel come up. She is one of your peers. She's a yo. She was a first-year resident when she attended the Congressional Advocacy Day at the Mid-Year Forum. She's going to share with us her experience. She's now a second-year resident at UC Davis. And a fun fact about Rachel, she spent some time in Siberia. I don't think she's going to be talking about that, but
no, not
anyway.
Won't be talking about Siberia today. So thanks for being here. My name's Rachel Simpson. I'm a second-year resident, and I've been asked to speak with you for a few minutes about advocacy. Now, I have to admit that when the Young Ophthalmology Committee first asked me to do this talk, I was a little surprised because unlike pretty much everyone else that we hear at Academy, I am not actually the world's foremost expert on the subject I was asked to present. In fact, I'm pretty much just an average resident. If you happen to run into my program director at any point during the conference, he'll be more than happy to confirm that fact for you. So, why would the Young Ophthalmology Committee ask me to give this talk? Well, I have a couple theories, and I hope by the end I will be able to convince you that they weren't totally crazy. But first, I want to start with the story of how I came to be an advocate. 2 weeks into my residency, I was called to the emergency room to evaluate a patient for new visual field defects. I'm going to skip right to the good stuff here and tell you that her pressures were in the high 30s, and her nerves looked like that. So the backstory on her, 45-year-old female, positive family history of glaucoma. She just moved to California from Arizona, a state that incidentally happens to have much more liberal scope of practice laws than we do in California. Anyway, in Arizona, she had had dilated eye exams every year for the last 15 years, and she'd never once heard the word glaucoma. So you can imagine why she was completely heartbroken when we showed her her visual fields in clinic the next day. Now, a couple weeks later, about the time my patient was getting ready for a trab, we got an email from our program director letting us know about a bill that was working its way through the California legislature that would drastically expand scope of practice for optometrists to include incisional eyelid surgery and laser glaucoma surgery. So I think you can all understand why this did not sit well with me. And in between patients in clinic one day, I decided I was going to do something about it. So I emailed all the members of the assembly who were hearing the bill and explained to them why I thought that was a terrible idea. It took about 6 minutes. And in that 6 minutes, I went from being a totally average resident to being an average resident who was also an advocate. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room with a sad story like this, and some of you probably have a lot worse stories to share. The question that we all face is, when we encounter stories like this, what do we do with that frustration and anger that we feel? What do we do with the passion that we have to protect our patients and our practice? How do we channel that into something that is actually productive? And the answer, of course, is through advocacy. Now, my next step in my little advocacy journey was attending the Mid-Year Forum and Congressional Advocacy Day as an advocacy ambassador. It's an incredible program. I can't recommend it more strongly. I got to lobby on Capitol Hill with the help of some amazing mentors who taught us and inspired us and mentored us along the way. I got to tell my patient stories to some of the most influential decision makers in our country. But it's important to understand that I was by no means a natural at this. In fact, when I started out, I was totally over my head and overwhelmed. I was perfectly content to just sit in the back, let everybody else who were the actual advocacy experts do all the advocating for me while I just smiled and nodded and kind of appreciated that I was in Washington, D.C. It was actually a mentor here who pointed at me and said, hey, by the way, you're going to present this bill. So I went from being totally overwhelmed over the course of one day to being able to walk into Senator Barbara Boxer's office and talk to her staff about issues that are critical to our profession. And that's exactly what the Advocacy Ambassador Program was designed to do, to train and inspire the next generation of ophthalmologists to advocate for our profession. Now, an interesting question to consider is why the Academy felt like it needed to develop the Advocacy Ambassador Program to begin with. And the answer to that is pretty easy. It's because before the Advocacy Ambassador Program got started, Mid-Year Forum, it looked a lot like this. There was lots of gray hair in the audience, not a lot of young people. So the picture's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's not all that far from the truth. And the other thing that we have to realize is that our mentors and teachers, the pillars of our profession, the people who are lecturing to us throughout this conference, they're not going to be around forever to do this job for us. They are absolutely looking to our generation to take up the fight with them. And one of the things that we know is that our generation, we're just a little bit less involved than those that have come before us. And this is true across all specialties. Ophthalmology is certainly not the only one. But we know that young doctors aren't joining their professional societies with nearly the same frequency. We're also not advocating with nearly the same frequency. So I thought it might be interesting to talk about why I think that is. I came up with a little list, and it was pretty easy because these are all excuses I used to make all the time. First is time. Look, we're all crazy busy in here. If we're in this room, that means we're a resident, a fellow, or we're just starting out and building a practice. There is more to know and more to do and less time to do it in. A lot of us have young families at home. That's my little monster right there. She holds me hostage every night until I put her to sleep. I don't get any help from my husband. He's up curing erectile dysfunction, selling penis implants to every man over the age of 65. It's true. Money. Look, our student loan debt burden is far greater than physicians who trained 20 or 30 years ago. Add to that reduced reimbursement rates, and ophthalmologists, we just don't have as much to work with as people have in the past. Plus, as residents, we're pretty much flat broke, right? So we have to do more with less, and we have to make sure that when we're investing our money into things, we get a really high return on investment. Interest. So politics can be pretty crazy. My example of this is the fact that Donald Trump is actually a legitimate contender for the Republican presidential nomination, right? So people like us who tend to value reason and logic, this can be kind of off-putting for us to deal with the kind of craziness that happens in politics every day. And last is knowledge. You know, we're all pretty smart people here. We are experts in pathophysiology and biology. Some of us even like optics. I am certainly not one of them. But we're much more comfortable dissecting an eye than we are dissecting pieces of legislation. Plus, again, let's admit it, ophthalmologists, we tend to be a little obsessive-compulsive. And when we feel like we're not an expert at something and we're asked to speak about that, it makes us all uncomfortable. Kind of like how I was a little bit when I was asked to give this talk. And so for a lot of us, we'd rather just leave this to the experts. We'd rather just leave advocacy to people who actually know what they're doing and stick to, diagramming lenses. But none of that actually matters, and I'll tell you why. First, here's a very long, comprehensive list of all the reasons why we should get involved. And I can tell you that every single thing on here, I can actually relate back to patient care. Unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss all of them, but I do want to highlight just a few. The first is EMR and meaningful use relief. This would offer significant relief to people in our profession who are facing they're facing problems due to EMR and meaningful use, and we're actually trying to get a bill passed through Congress before the end of the year. And Sage Bauer, who is the advocacy coordinator for the embassy, has asked me to distribute this form widely and have as many people sign it as possible, because this would be huge relief for a lot of our practitioners who are suffering right now. And of course, like I said, I can relate these all to patient care, and that's the number one reason to get involved, is because our patients, they can't advocate for themselves. We're lucky if our patients know the difference between an optometrist and an ophthalmologist. It's unrealistic to expect them to knock down the doors of Congress and explain why letting optometrists do laser glaucoma surgery might be a dangerous thing to do. We absolutely have to do that for them. All right, so we've all decided we're going to get involved. What are the ways to do that? First, Congressional Advocacy Day. Now, I've already talked about this a little bit, so I don't want to belabor the point except to tell you that it's amazing and you don't have to be an expert to go. This is absolutely built for people like you in the audience. And there is nothing more empowering or inspiring than lobbying on Capitol Hill. Once you've been an advocate there, you can pretty much go anywhere and be successful. And that actually brings me to our second point. Oftentimes when we think about advocacy, we have a tendency to think of Capitol Hill and Washington, D.C., and all the glamour that goes along with it. And we forget that a lot of the decisions that are made that affect our patients and our practices on a daily basis are actually made at the state level by people like this, or this, or this. So surprisingly, none of these people are actually experts in ophthalmology, right? They are going to do what their constituents tell them to do. And if the only constituents they're hearing from happen to be optometrists, then you can bet they're going to sign the scope of practice bills that are placed on their desk. And the only reason that the California legislature did not pass the scope of practice bill that they were trying to was because the California State Society was out in full force every day trying to fight it. Now, membership in your state society does cost money, right? But that money is directly invested back into protecting your patients and your practice. So that's a pretty high return on investment. Most of the state societies I looked into all have discounts for young ophthalmologists, so money is not an excuse here. Next is Ophthpac and the Surgical Scope Fund. Now, I know the president of the Academy already talked to you guys a little bit about this, but I can tell you that I was able to join both of these at the Academy, and they were both surprisingly affordable. Each one is $50 each for residents. I can tell you I don't miss those $100. I can also tell you that the only reason our state societies are successful in their efforts is because they get direct funding from these organizations. Next is the AAO Advocacy App. So everybody has an app these days. The AAO is now one of them. This app was actually developed for the mid-year forum, but it is currently updated all the time by Sage Bauer, who's our advocacy coordinator. So if you go online right now, in fact, all of you who have your phones out and are checking Facebook can actually head on over to the App Store and download the app. It takes about 10 seconds to download and another 10 seconds to send an email through it. It's really easy, it's user-friendly, it has nice executive summaries of all the legislation that we're currently supporting. And that's actually it. That's pretty much all I have, except for a couple last points. I want to say that you don't have to be in Washington, D.C., or even at your state legislature to be an advocate. You're an advocate every time you talk about our profession. So anytime you talk to a patient, anytime you talk to a family member, anytime you're out in the community and telling them what we do and why we do it, you are advocating for our profession. And I just want to say, I've been thinking, again, like I said, about why the young ophthalmologist asked me to give this talk. And I think the answer is this. You know, we heard very similar things from the Academy president earlier today, but I think it means one thing coming from such a great leader, and another coming from someone who is literally just like you, who's just as broke and just as pressed for time. We are all sort of in this fight together. I like to think of advocacy similar to vaccines. So anybody in the room an anti-vaccine advocate? Right? Probably not. And if you were, you wouldn't admit it here. It's the same philosophy, right? So you vaccinate your kid, not because you think your kid is going to get measles and die, but because it's the right thing to do for everyone else. Advocacy is the same way. It only works when everyone does their share. And if you start deciding that, I'm not going to advocate because I don't really have enough time, or I really can't afford to, I don't really know what's going on, I'm not really that interested in politics, then that little herd immunity that we're all protected from starts to fall apart. So I would just say, don't be an anti-vaxxer. Everyone be an advocate. That's all I have.
Thank you, Rachel.
Actually, sorry, one last thing. Sage asked me to hand out those little forms. So if anyone is interested in signing their name to the EMR Relief Act, they're trying to get really as many signatures as possible. So we're handing those out in the back. Just raise your hand if you want to sign one.
Thank you, Rachel. And one more time, big hand for Rachel, and again for Dr. Bill Lloyd.